and a kind of reduction of representation to the idea that interests are formed inside the state. But what I want to argue is that interests are, of course, formed in the space of the economy. It's in the economy where conditions of work and exploitation of both waged labor and unwaged labor give rise to particular kinds of class and gender-related demands. They stem, for example, from the informal economy where traders do not have the protections of law and social policy, and where, we can have the Gauteng minister, Toby Mekwe, say, don't give to the poor. They just want to make money without working, or where we can have Lindiwe Sisulu say, young people don't need housing, they must work, right? So that's a kind of carelessness. I'm referring to a kind of a flippant approach to the needs that arise from within a highly unequal set of economic relationships that continues to be shaped by the past, that continues to be shaped by structures of exclusion that come from the past. So a failure to really engage with those, a failure to engage with the ways in which women's unpaid care burdens place limits on the extent to which they can actually participate in economic and political life. So the relationship of thick representation and democratic participation that was embodied in the two charters has really been replaced by a form of policy making in which it is assumed that government knows best. Now, I would say we have a kind of feminism in which it's no longer just father knows best, but mother knows best. But father and mother in parliament are part of the same elite wielding the same traditional forms of power. So let me look a little more in detail at, for example, the three core demands that you see in the Charter. Political equality, I've spoken about. Legal equality. In the Constitution, women's organizations were successful in saying that equality should trump cultural values of gender difference. The demand for socio-economic rights, and affirmative action, okay? Through the mobilization of the LGBTI movement, by the way, not traditionally part of the women's movement. There's another story of struggle. Sexual rights are now in the Constitution, and reproductive rights as well. So we have had some sorts of progress in two key areas, for example. We had the quota and women entering parliament. We had supposedly a set of institutional structures that were meant to be the space for articulating policy interests, women's policy interests. They've been a complete failure. Those institutions, which we call the National Machinery for Women, have been tossed about and thrown around as if they were simply mechanisms for patronage and upward mobility and party loyalty. We could say a lot about the carelessness with which those institutions were treated, not only by the male leaders in Parliament, but also by the women who occupied those positions. The second area of rapid change, we saw the removal of most forms of unfair legal discrimination from the statute books. For example, a lot of what the charters wanted, the right to contract, the right of women to inherit, to own property, to obtain credit, these are all secured in South African law. And in law and both law and social policies, the kinds of demands in respect of a diversity of family forms, dismantling the ideological notion of the nuclear family, and understanding the diverse arrangements, social arrangements in South Africa, have been on paper recognized. But in fact, in practice, we move away from what's on paper. We have the bifurcated system of law and government that we inherited from apartheid hasn't been properly dismantled. In the rural areas, areas that are under the control of traditional authorities, despite the constitutional guarantees, women are less likely to have an equal political voice. In practice, some chiefs, in fact, do facilitate the participation of women. Some chiefs recognize the need for the democratization of traditional institutions. But interestingly, the party that you would have thought would uphold the rights of women, the ANC, has been less than reliable. For example, and these are things we know, right? It introduced the traditional courts bill, which would have meant that rural black women would have to contend with a system of governance based on the denial of equality, something that you and I here living in a city don't have to deal with. It was a deeply unpopular bill. Here's a positive part of the story, Jackie. 7 out of 9 provinces refused to ratify it, and a powerful civil society movement was launched to challenge it, led by Nomoni Sogasa, who did speak at SWOP earlier. That was ultimately extremely successful. It stopped the bill in its tracks. But that introduction of that bill was an interesting harbinger of what we can expect if we rely too much on the state, right? It was a reminder that the legislative gains that we think are made when they are put on paper can easily be reversed if you have the rise of a traditionalist element in government that pays little heed, that is careless towards the demands that were represented in the struggles of the 20th century anyway. Even in relation to customary law and its uses in our courts, we have made some progress, but not too many. It's only very recently, for example, that Muslim marriages and marriages between people of the same sex have become recognized in civil law. But changes to the marital regime have been very slow, and equality in marriage actually is still not fully legally guaranteed, believe it or not, due to resistance by cultural brokers like priests. Within families, women's the demand for aspects of the demands for change within families, the ability for women to make sexual decisions, the access to household finances, some of which have been recognized in the law, for example, in the Choice and Termination of Pregnancy Act. But in practice, government does not put resources behind this, does not force doctors to actually abide by the law. It allows doctors, for example, to exit grounds that it violates their religious views. So poor women struggle to obtain abortions in government health facilities, and the consequence is that illegal abortions remain only too prevalent for poor women. Of violence against women are quite interesting for what they reveal in the relationships between women and men. Because in fact it is intimate partner violence, violence by men against the women they know are in relationships with the women they are in relationships with, account for approximately half of all female homicides in South Africa. So women remain highly unsafe within the home. Reports of domestic violence made to the police have increased by 18% between 2011 and 2012. The rise of traditionalist values in politics, represented, for example, by the president himself, who has recently commented that really the most appropriate ambition for young women has been, it should be, to aim at marriage, has not helped to shift values away from the kinds of norms that suggest that women are in some way under the control of men. I'm going to return to that in a minute. It's not only male political leaders who exemplify this backtracking on support for gender equality. You'll remember the comments made by the former Minister of Women, Lulu Kumwana, at an exhibition of artwork by women, who said that the exhibition of the representations of women's nudity and women's sexuality in art in the public sphere was extremely distasteful and not appropriate for black women. This year, this week in fact, as we've launched 16 days of activism yet again by a government that has refused to do very much about violence against women, the current Minister of Women, former trade unionist Susan Shabangu, has outraged feminist activists by designing a program that is entirely centered on men and that puts the patriarchal notion of men as protectors of women at the core of the government's strategy. This launch of the 16 days of activism took place earlier this week, invited traditional leaders to launch the program, the core of the program. Mpumalanga Chief Moses Moshlavu advised women to be submissive to their husbands in order to reduce violence against women. Princess Dineo from the Northwest Province described feminism as un-African, and she said to the minister in this meeting that the minister should cut all funds to centres for abused women and children, as these are issues that should be dealt with at home. Okay? Now these are all the kinds of values that in 1954 in the Women's Charter, women were saying they want to change, they want to move beyond those. So 70 years later, we've not even made progress on these rather, I would say these are fairly superficial aspects. This is the very minimum, the least you would expect. Pay at least some lip service to the ideas that are in these charters. Okay? So these values of gender equality, not only are they not supported among the elites, increasing support, we're in this kind of schizophrenic system in which, on the one hand, we're constantly talking about the importance of getting more women in government, and it's, this is part of the official policy of political parties, but at the same time, it is actively undermining support for women's sexual and political autonomy. It's no longer the case, as the 1994 Charter was worried about, that politics would be the arena of women. Sadly, it's no longer. It is, fortunately, it's no longer the arena of men. It's also the arena of women. But sadly, it is an arena of exactly the same kind of patriarchal politics that are carried by men. So, in the area that we might have thought that increasing women's representation would have made some difference to at least establishing a minimal set of conditions for respect between women and men, that has not happened. But moving to the underlying structure of our society, one very stark fact remains consistent from 54 to 94 to 2014. Women are still in the ranks of the poorest in society. Expansion of support, child support grants, social grants, has been a poverty alleviation tool, of course, but it cannot compensate for an economy with limited jobs, one, moreover, that has large sectors that are outside of the regulations on working conditions that have been secured for formal sector workers. And that's really significant because women are for 95% of workers in, for example, the area of domestic service, and that is the area of work that is least protected, in which women have the least capacity to enforce decent working conditions. According to the National Planning Commission, women-headed households are likely to be more poor, and despite the virtual elimination of gender differentiated access to education, women continue to earn less than men. 61% of women live in poverty, 31% live in destitution, compared with 39% of men living in poverty and 18% in destitution. The labour market participation rate, that is the proportion of the working age population between 15 and 65. 15 and 65, I don't want my daughter 18 to be working just yet. But okay, that proportion of the population that is economically active, again, huge disparities. The average Labour market participation rate of men in 2013 was 61.7%. For women, on average, it was 49.2%. And where are those women employed? They are involved mostly in men outnumber women in virtually every sector of industry, with the exception of community and social services. 95% of domestic workers, as I said, are women. The average annual income figures indicate that there's an even more significant gap between men and women. If you compare the 2001 and 2011 annual income figures of men and women, you see that the average annual income of a woman in 2011 is only slightly higher than what men earned in 2001. Okay, so women currently are not earning more than what men earned in 2001, while men's incomes have increased. Care responsibilities remain deeply gendered, despite the significant progress on the child support grant. From Stats SA, we learned that in general, responsibility for household work and caring for children and the elderly lies with women more than it does with men. Female respondents are 3 times more likely in the Stats SA survey to participate in the care of persons than male respondents. When a child under the age of 7 was living in a household, men spend a mean of 13 minutes on childcare a day. Women spend a mean of 18 minutes on childcare a day. By the way, only 3% of children live with their fathers, exclusively with their fathers. Something like 33% of children live with both their parents. Another 38% of children live only with their mothers, and only 3% of children live only with their fathers. So although women are bearing the brunt of this care, they are receiving no care in return, either from the state or the state or society. They continue to bear the brunt of weaknesses in service delivery, the exposure to violence in public spaces that are unsafe, poor transport networks that render them in a daily sense vulnerable. They continue to experience, as I said, violence at the hands of men in their own families. It is, in other words, an uncaring state. But feminist killjoys fortunately look not only upwards, we look sideways and we look downwards. And when we look sideways and downwards, we see that there is a more hopeful set of possibilities emerging in what many people are now calling a politics of refusal. A refusal to play the game, to laugh at the right moments. One aspect of that is the politics of refusal that we see played out in Parliament, and I think perhaps it's been the first time in a long time that we saw the use of a filibuster in Parliament yesterday, right? It is a politics of refusal to play into the superficial notion of parliamentary politics as if it meant anything significant in terms of accountability. So it's become glaringly apparent now that economic, social, and sexual rights can't only be secured by aligning the project of freedom to the party or to the state. As I said, activists are not sitting idly by as Minister Shabangu carelessly dismisses the idea of women as autonomous citizens, and I urge you to sign the petition that is circulating. But there is a thriving conversation in NGOs and women's organizations. Jackie has been involved in the Feminist Roundtable